Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Global Agenda at the University of Delaware. I'm Ralph Begleiter, and I'm always pleased to announce that Global Agenda is supported by the World Affairs Council of Wilmington and the University of Delaware. My thanks to UD's Center for International Studies, the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and the Department of Communication. And this year, the Muslim Students Association here at UD and the Jewish Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Federation of Delaware are also co-sponsoring Global Agenda. This week is a special week for a lot of people, and for many of us, tonight is a special night. It's also an anniversary pertinent to our topic and our speaker tonight. This year, the week between Good Friday and Easter also includes Passover. And I want to make special note of the fact that I realize that this program tonight conflicts with the first night of Passover. I hoped to avoid that, but I've been trying for 6 years to get John Burns on our Global Agenda stage, and this year and this date was the time it could happen. So those of us here tonight who might otherwise be enjoying a Passover Seder, I thank you very much for being here. And to those who cannot join us because of the holiday, I recognize your decision, and I suggest you might want to watch our podcast of this program on another day. To everyone celebrating a holiday this week, I wish you peace, health, and happiness. Now, I mentioned an anniversary. 6 years ago tomorrow, April 9th, the world watched as U.S. troops rolled into Baghdad and hoisted an American flag atop a statue of Saddam Hussein before pulling the statue down with chains. Among other things, at that moment, 2 groups of journalists came together in the Iraqi capital for the first time in the war. One group of reporters had been embedded with the Army, Marines, and other services as they invaded Iraq, looking for weapons of mass destruction, and bound to topple not just the statue of Saddam, but his brutal dictatorial government. I'm sure most of us watched that embedded reporting with fascination, because frankly it gave the world the best view of combat operations since the Vietnam War. The other group of journalists, much smaller and less elaborately equipped, was not embedded with American troops. Those journalists included a television reporter for Al Jazeera, the Arabic language television satellite news channel, who was killed when an American missile struck the roof of the building in Baghdad from which he was reporting live. There were a few wire service reporters and journalists from other international news organizations such as the BBC. And that group of reporters also included our speaker tonight, John Burns, who was in Baghdad for the New York Times. I remember reading his vivid reports from ground zero of the Iraq War and thinking at the time what an incredible counterpoint they were to the gung-ho versions of the war we were seeing from embedded journalists. Burns did not win a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting from Iraq. There was a lot of competition. And he had already won 2 of the prestigious journalism prizes in 1993 and again in 1997. In 97, his Pulitzer was awarded for what the prize committee called courageous and insightful coverage of the harrowing regime imposed on Afghanistan by the Taliban in 1997. And in 1993, John won the Pulitzer for what the jury called his courageous and thorough coverage of the destruction of Sarajevo and the barbarous killings in the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina. The word courageous keeps coming up, and the words insightful and thorough. If somehow you have escaped reading John Burns' work in the New York Times, you really must treat yourself to what journalism is supposed to be. His work in Bosnia, covering the modern-era barbarism of nationalistic Serbs against Muslims, and his work in Afghanistan, covering the barbarism of 1990s Muslims against their own people, and his work covering the war in Iraq from the receiving end of the American attacks, are what make John Burns a perfect speaker for us as we try to understand tonight the relationship among the wars in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. John Burns started his career in 1971, writing for the Toronto Globe and Mail from China. He joined the New York Times in 1976 and has been with them ever since, reporting then from South Africa, where he earned another of journalism's highest honors, the Polk Award. In 1981, he moved to Moscow, where he covered the last few years of the Cold War in the Soviet Union. And although we haven't been able to nail it down, I think that's where I first met John, in Moscow. He moved back to Beijing as Times bureau chief in China, during which time he was jailed by the Chinese government as a spy, then expelled when the charges were dropped. Then home to Toronto for a few years. Then he covered the Bosnia War from Belgrade and Sarajevo in the early 1990s, of course, and moved to India as New York Times New Delhi bureau chief in 1994. Since reporting on the run-up to the US invasion of Iraq, he's been covering the occupation. He's currently the London bureau chief of the New York Times. He studied at McGill University in Montreal, Russian at Harvard, Chinese at Cambridge, and he also speaks German and French. Please welcome John Fisher Burns to the University of Delaware.
I'd like to say thank you to the World Affairs Council of Wilmington and to the perfectly splendid chairman, I suppose, or president, Mr. Wendell Fenton, who I think is down there somewhere with his magnificent bow tie. A matter, as I remarked to him at dinner, reminded me that only 2 weeks ago, in writing an obituary of a former British ambassador to Washington who persuaded Ronald Reagan to back Britain during the Falklands War, I described him as a flamboyant character and illustrated this by saying that he carried in his pocket at all times a copy of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, a slightly pretentious gesture, I'd have thought, and wore a bow tie. The editors came back to me and said the Thucydides stays in the story, but the bow tie doesn't, because the bow tie is no guarantee of flamboyance. Well, I can tell you in the case of Wendell Fenton, it is. And as for Pulitzer Prizes, by the way, before I get into the serious business of the evening, two Pulitzer Prizes is nothing as against your future commencement speaker, Mr. Friedman, I believe. Is that this year? Yes. Tom Friedman will be only happy to tell you that, as he reminds me frequently, that he has appointed me in Pulitzers, to which I remind him that I've beaten him on the golf course more often than he has me. So if you find him a little bit boastful when he's down here, please do remind him of that. It's an inhibiting thing for a journalist to stand before an audience like yours. It often seems to me that it's life inverted, that I should be down there, which is where I've spent most of my life, listening to people speak and often thinking how poorly they did it, without, as I now discover, learning a damn thing about how to do it, which is in some ways a kind of epitaph for the journalist. I think journalists do best when they are not celebrated, when they are, if not celebrities, somewhat anonymous. And I dare hazard that the reason that I'm here tonight, and possibly some of you are here tonight, is not because of 34 or 5 years on the front page of the New York Times, where one can be relatively anonymous, because there are many people who read the New York Times and other newspapers without paying a lot of attention to who writes the stories, but because recent years and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have put me on television. And it makes a big difference. For a brief season, and I think it won't even be 15 minutes, more like 5, I found that I am recognized in America. In fact, I'm recognized elsewhere where there are Americans, on high streets and in airports, as I was the other day in New York, on my way down to Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania, from where I was collected today by Ralph. A fellow, it was pouring with rain, a fellow on Fifth Avenue pointed at me from about 20 yards away, and I thought, what have I done? He said, "You the Iraq guy." And I thought, okay, it'll be interesting, let's just test this out. And I said, do you mind if I take 20 seconds of your time? He clearly, as far as he was concerned, our exchange was over at that point. And I said to him, in what sense am I the Iraq guy? He said, I've seen you on TV. I'm not sure whether he was Brooklyn or Queens. He was somewhere from that general area. And he was obviously very impatient. And I said, what do you remember? What was I doing on television? Do you remember where I was? He said, well, I saw you. I said, I seen you in Baghdad. I said, well, do you remember anything I said? Or who I worked for? No, I don't remember any of that. He said, all I remember is you needed a goddamn haircut. If you'll excuse my French. Well, I just want to make the point, I did have a haircut last week because the President of the United States came to London and I knew I would be in close proximity, and I just thought this was an occasion, if ever there was one in my life, to make that gesture. Although I don't think the President of the United States could have cared less, to tell you the truth. I thought I'd just begin, although it's not immediately, I suppose, relevant. I suppose it is. Just make a few remarks about President Obama, who made his international debut last week. We at the New York Times are rightly required to be impartial as to the outcome of American elections, and it was between the parties. And I don't have a vote in American elections. And for all I know, the promise that President Obama has shown will not be fulfilled. We don't know that. But what I can say is that if he were to be judged on the basis of his first appearance on the international stage, especially as witnessed from close up, it was extremely impressive. All the things that I think that you Americans saw last year on the election campaign trail were apparent in large measure at the G20 meeting in London. An extraordinary personal affability and grace, a very, very quick mind, and perhaps most importantly, a natural instinct to find the middle way. And that wasn't easy last week. We might have imagined that the principal conflict when you gathered 80 nations together in the midst of this crisis would be between the United States and its old foes, Russia, China, and some of the more strident countries of the Third World, but it wasn't. The real push-pull last week was between the United States and the United Kingdom on the one hand, those that President Sarkozy calls les Anglos, and France and Germany on the other. And that push-pull over the question of what you might call Anglo-American capitalism was part of a wider, if you will, and to a large extent unspoken struggle, which was, are we now entering a period in which American power will be deconstructed? And some of the leaders are quite explicit about that. President Sarkozy, for all that he may be in some respects the most pro-American president of France in my lifetime, can be quite hard-edged about that. And he has said, I can't quote him directly on this, but he has said things to the effect of, the days of the old dominance are over. Chancellor Merkel has said something of the same thing. Both of them have spoken about, as Sarkozy said in one moment of irritation last week, this crisis, after all, did not begin here. Well, we know what he was implying. Prime Minister Brown of Great Britain, of whom I've seen a good deal, I suppose you would say, true politician that he is, he strikes different chords depending on which side of the Atlantic he is. When he went to the European Parliament in Strasbourg, about a week before the G20 met last week, he issued a clarion call for Europe to assert itself, saying that we are now the biggest market, we know where this problem came from, and we understand the importance of social justice. He didn't say the Americans don't, but it was clearly implied that the problem had come from America, which he has said in public, and that reconstructing the Bretton Woods settlement, if one could call it that, lead to be taken by the Europeans in introducing notions of social justice as though those were alien to the American public. It was into this that President Obama appeared. I thought it was a critically important moment, the note that he struck. He was emollient, he placated, he said some very deft things about responsibility. He said, you may know this if you watched television coverage of it, he said in respect to a question about the blame for the present crisis, he said that when he was a professor, when he was a student of law, he is humble enough not to say where, but we know where he was, a student of law. He said one of his professors had said in respect of disputes at law that there is blame for some and responsibility for all, which struck me as being an extremely deft way of summarizing what happened. There's no escaping, of course, the truth that much of what happened did begin on Wall Street or in Washington, D.C., but it's also true that greed and recklessness were not a strictly American contagion, and the City of London was a monument to that. As a matter of fact, the City of London thrived in the last 10 or 15 years precisely because it was offered a less regulated market than Wall Street did. And we had a Chancellor of the Exchequer, I forget his name, for 10 years during that period, who, in my presence at the Mansion House in London at the annual dinner, wearing an evening coat and a white bow tie, celebrated that London had become, if I recall correctly, the financial capital of the world. It had overtaken Wall Street. And why was that? Was it because the air was better in London? I don't think so. I think it was because it was a much easier environment for casino banking and for hedge funds to operate in, thus Lehman Brothers and Goldman Sachs having enormous offices in London. So, although it's some way away from the main point of discussion tonight, I'd just like to say, as a European, as an Englishman, that I feel very uncomfortable with the idea that America should be the one held principally to blame for what happened. There's plenty of blame to go around, as I also feel that the reconstruction of the international financial system, whilst necessary, will end up with some of the fundamentals unchanged. And those fundamentals, too, President Obama referred to. He said, and the whole trip was really about a change of tone. He said, we didn't come here to dictate, we came here to listen. We came here to build partnerships and to negotiate. You'll recall, I'm sure, that he said the days of Roosevelt and Churchill sitting in a private room over a brandy are over. This is not that kind of negotiation. But he fairly quickly said, too, and I felt with some conviction, that the United States remains ready to lead, and he reminded the press conference that he gave in London, without any bombast at all, I felt, that the United States remains the world's predominant political, military, and economic power and was prepared to assume its responsibilities. I thought it was just about pitch perfect, and this was done without a single note. It was a wonderful thing, as I'm sure you saw, to see a President of the United States at town hall meetings in France and in Germany, and again in Turkey, being surrounded by people shouting his name, reaching out for his hands, waving American flags. Who could have imagined that? He said on a number of occasions, speaking of his own wonder at the moment, who could have imagined 80 nations coming together and agreeing so quickly on a new charter for international finance? Who could have imagined, he said, as if it was an afterthought, he said as recently as 5 years ago that there would be a President of the United States by the name of Barack Hussein Obama. In Europe last week, he used that same formula several times, and I think it was no chance. I don't know, but I'm guessing that his second name was not prominent in campaign speeches here last year. It's a very powerful signal to Europeans. And we are, of course, at a critical juncture in the affairs of the world that few of us could have imagined a few years ago. This may turn out, of course, to be more vision than accomplishment, more tone than substance. We'll have to see where it all goes. But it struck me more than once, this may be a cliched idea, particularly when he spoke about fear and the corrosive quality of fear and the need for people to feel hope and for their leaders to transmit a sense of confidence, that there were strong echoes of March 1933. And let us hope that it is so this time, that America has once again found a leader who can help us through these most testing times. My own feeling, obiter dicta you might say, but I'm not an American citizen, so I feel freer to say it than if I were, is that those who have predicted, foreseen, and hoped for the end of the American empire in our time, if one can call it that, will be disappointed. And for some very powerful reasons. One of which is as President Obama pointed out, the continuing prevailing power and wealth of the United States. The second of them is that this country still is a shining city on the hill. It's true that you can go to many a city in the world, at least the world I've traveled, and you can see the main squares filled with people of near riotous intent shouting down with America and burning American presidents in effigy. But I've also noticed over the last 30 or more years that if you go down the street and around the corner to the American embassy, you see a crowd of not much lesser density queuing up at the visa office of the United States Embassy. Sometimes I like to imagine the very same people on the same day. The world, Europe certainly, and much of the world, has a schizophrenic attitude towards the United States, which is, I would think, probably the lot of all empires. I've no doubt it was true of the Romans, to whom we in England, amongst others, owe so much. I've no doubt it was true of ourselves. I know it was true of the British Empire, that we were loved and hated, and that the Indians who so much wanted us to go wept when we left. I think it's just the lot of the United States to endure that, but I think you should know, and if you doubted it, President Obama has certainly reminded us of it, that there's a tremendous wellspring of goodwill towards the United States in the world, that America still sets the standards, and in my view, because of another quality in America, beyond liberty, because of America's power to reinvent itself, which is an extraordinary thing. The British Empire was unable to do that, as was the Roman Empire. But America, this was not called the New World for nothing, a country that invented itself from a charter. It's an astonishing thing. It continues to be an astonishing thing. And I have seen, even in recent times, the power of America to reinvent itself on the battlefield of Iraq, which we will come to in a short time, with quite remarkable effects. The American Army has a practice called lessons learned, which I think is also replicated in American industry. It's a wonderful system, quite absent from the operations of most armies that I know in the field. If an infantry platoon is attacked on patrol by something that's different, some new kind of improvised explosive device, some new kind of ambush, the experience will be chronicled, passed up the chain all the way to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, analyzed and sent all the way down to every platoon in every unit at combat within 24 hours. Lessons to be learned. To me, is a small expression of something that is innate to the American character. If it doesn't work, okay, let's start again. Let's reinvent the wheel. I think America is now in the process of reinventing the wheel, and I would say thank God for that. Which brings me to the problems that we're here to discuss tonight: Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. I'll begin with what, in some ways, is the easiest of the three. And who could have imagined 2 years ago that I could say that? That's Iraq. You heard the President say quite recently in a forum, I think here in the United States before he left for his tour of Europe and the Middle East, that he himself could never have imagined that Iraq would be the least of his problems in the first 90 days of his presidency. I lived through the darkest days in Iraq, and they were very dark indeed. And there's no doubt that the war was well on its way to being lost and disastrously lost by the end of 2006. And then there was the surge. And I think it's worth remembering at a time when the now former president is held, I think, rather widely in low regard in this country, that even if we concede all that the bill of attainder that his detractors would raise against him, there was one thing he did, and he did almost alone, that was brave and proved to be correct, and that was the surge. In December of 2006, he was virtually alone, even with his own administration, in deciding to send 30,000 extra troops to Iraq. You'll remember how unpopular that was at the time, how it was denounced by both of the principal candidates of the Democratic Party for the presidency. And he handed the baton to David Petraeus. At that time, I went to speak to the president in private conversation in the White House, which developed from a relationship of a kind that I'd had with him since we were both young men in China. A faraway time, in a faraway country. He was the son of the then American ambassador in all but name, his father, George H.W. Bush. I was the correspondent in China, and George and Barbara Bush introduced me to their oldest son, being of the same generation because they thought we would have something in common on the tennis court and trading a few horses and having a bit of fun. So I've known him for a very long time. I hope that I have not lost perspective as a result of that. But he invited me to go and talk about the war in the White House. And I don't need to detain you with the whole of that conversation, which was very interesting and which was off the record, made a little uncomfortable by the fact that he hadn't given an interview to the New York Times for 5 years. So my editor required of me that if I was to accept the invitation, I should begin our conversation by saying, you shouldn't be talking to me, you should be talking to our White House correspondents. Oh, he said, we're working on that. So when I called up our White House correspondent immediately afterwards and said, the president's working on it, he said, well, he's been working on it for 5 years. Anyway, we talked about many things, but one of the things he said was that he liked George Casey, but George Casey was a kind of Vince Lombardi. I don't think the former president would object, since it was a very unusual situation, a journalist in the Oval Office, and I had agreed with the editor that we wouldn't get into politics, with the editor of the New York Times, but after 2 minutes, as I said to the president, this is a nonsense. There's no way we can discuss the war in Iraq if we avoid politics. It's all politics. So I'm prepared to discuss this with you frankly, but I have to ask you to be sure that this conversation doesn't go beyond this room. And then paused for a second and thought, this is certainly a world upside down in which a journalist is telling the President of the United States that this conversation is off the record. Anyway, he said, Casey, he said, I love George Casey, who, by the way, is a very fine officer, a gentleman. He's kind of Vince Lombardi. He kind of grinds it down a yard at a time. He said, you know what I wanted? I said, I wanted somebody like, I think it's Jimmy Johnson. Jimmy Johnson, was he the coach of the Dallas Cowboys? I should have checked this out before I came here tonight. He said, you know, I like him. He's the long ball guy. He said, Dave Petraeus is my long ball guy. So I went back to Iraq. Within a few days, I was at Camp Victory, the same location that you saw President Obama in last night, the great pillared dome of what was one of Saddam's palaces right adjacent to Baghdad International Airport. And I was talking to somebody, and there were two hands clamped on my shoulders, and I turned around, and it's General Petraeus, who's about 5'9", rather a slight figure, newly decorated with his 4th star. And I said, oh, I've just been talking to your boss. And he looked at me because, you know, as if to say, what do you mean, boss? I'm the boss. I said, no, I mean the boss in Washington, D.C. And a little dark look came over his face. He said, you were talking to Chairman of the Joint Chiefs? I said, no, I was talking to the Commander-in-Chief. Oh, what did he say? He said, you were his long ball guy. You're the guy with the Hail Mary pass. David Petraeus said, I wish. What long ball? Well, they did have a long ball, turned out. It wasn't the 30,000 troops, American troops alone, that accomplished it, as you know. There were many other factors, principal amongst them the Sunni awakening. One of the discomforting things about talking to an audience like yourself in the age of mass communications and satellite television is that I have to assume that there's not much I can tell you about the war that you don't already know. So you know about the Sunni awakening and the 80,000 Sunnis who essentially changed sides and became, in a matter of weeks or months, they gave up the insurgency and they became our newest best friends. And some people say, don't give Petraeus, don't give Serge too much credit. It was the awakening. These things were indelibly linked. All opinion in Iraq for a very long time, and certainly since 1979 when Saddam Hussein became president of Iraq, is intimidation-led. And opinion in Iraq during the first 4 years of the insurgency followed the principal intimidator, and the principal intimidator were the insurgents. It was extremely difficult for the United States to gain any traction, especially when the troops were commuting to war from large bases on the outskirts of the city. David Petraeus, who had rewritten the counterinsurgency manual of the United States Army during his 18 months or 2 years out at Fort Leavenworth, said, okay, we're not going to commute to war anymore, we're going to put boots on the ground in the neighborhoods. All of a sudden, they began to find intelligence flowing. The insurgents came to a conclusion that I thought they would have come to much earlier, the Sunni insurgents, which is that since their principal problem was that power had passed to the Shiite minority, at least in the short term, the United States was not their enemy. The United States was a natural ally. Why? Because as long as the United States is there, the Constitution which Iraq adopted in the summer of 2004, which provides extensive minority rights, was the best guarantee that the Sunnis are going to have. To go to war with the United States in Iraq was maybe an intuitive thing to do for the Sunnis when they were usurped, but it wasn't entirely an intelligent thing to do. And there was a change of opinion. And the Sunnis came to the realization that, first of all, the United States was not going to be driven out of Iraq very quickly, and even if it were, it wouldn't be such a good idea. We started to hear Sunni leaders say, no, we don't want the Americans out. In any case, you saw what happened. My wife continues to work in Iraq, so I have my own, although I've been gone for a year, I have my own private pipeline into events there day by day. And Baghdad is a transformed city, as much of Iraq is a transformed country. The violence is down by 90%. The rhythms of life are reasserting themselves. Tourists are going to Iraq, if you can believe it. We had an article, I think, in the New York Times quite recently about tourists who went on a religious, not a religious pilgrimage but to religious sites. My wife, who is the chief administrator of the New York Times operation in Iraq, which is the largest one that we have had anywhere ever, is doing things which initially I found very frightening. I had a rule when I was the bureau chief there that nobody stayed more than 15 minutes in any one place. It's a pretty difficult thing to do serious reporting in those circumstances, but it was that bad. And she was going out about the town and spending 2 or 3 hours trying to get Mercedes-Benz armored cars fixed by the so-called Mercedes-Benz dealer, whose principal business then and now was not repairing the car but taking as many pieces off it as he could in the time allotted and replacing them with parts taken from battered Chevrolets. It's a transformed country, and would that it will stay that way. But as you know, this, and to use General Petraeus' term, is fragile and reversible. The United States Army learned many lessons in the first years of the war, and one of them was not again, at least in this generation, to be illusionist. So far have they moved from illusion, in my view, that they have tended to understate, not overstate, what they've accomplished. Extraordinary things have been accomplished, but it could all yet be lost. And it was discouraging to see that President Obama could not go beyond Camp Victory, the command headquarters, which is not more than a mile from where Air Force One would have been parked at Baghdad Airport, because, so I heard on the television this morning, on the day before yesterday, there were 6 suicide bombings in Baghdad with some 40 victims, making it one of the worst, and these were Sunni insurgent bombings of Shiite victims, one of the worst days in the last year and a half or two. There is a serious risk as the drawdown, the 19-month drawdown, gathers pace, that the Sunni insurgents will go back to business. The awakening fellows are already fingering their triggers. The government of Iraq, Nouri Kamal al-Maliki, which has shown an unlimited capacity for short-sightedness and doing things which are injurious to their own interests in the long run, a matter which drove every American commander and every American ambassador in my time to great degrees of frustration. I asked General Petraeus one day if it was true that he and Nouri Kamal al-Maliki had stood across from the table from each other, shouting at each other over the question of the failure of the Iraqi government to use the political space created by the surge to move towards true reconciliation with the Sunnis. General Petraeus answered me by saying, well, no, he said, it's not a complete truth. He said, let me say to you that the exchange which you referred to, we were both seated. The Maliki government has failed to keep its pledges to the United States about the integration of tens of thousands of the former insurgents of the tribal awakening, of the awakening councils, into the armed forces. They've taken about 5,000 out of 80,000, mostly into the police, not the army. So you still have an Iraqi army which is overwhelmingly Shiite in the ranks and Shiite-led. It's the mirror image of the Saddam army. There's a serious risk that when the countervailing force of American troops in the cities, and they're to be withdrawn on June the 30th, pull away from the cities, you're going to see a return to much more violence. We may hope that it isn't. There are some reasons to think that it won't be. Amongst them, the exhaustion of the people of Iraq with the war, the fact that they've begun to enjoy a relatively more peaceful society, that the same phenomenon that brought the war in Lebanon, insofar as it did end, to an end, which was the exhaustion of all parties, the inability to tolerate the levels of killing, that will play out. But I think we should note how the subtleties of President Obama's drawdown plan. It provides for the withdrawal of only 2 combat brigades this year, out of, I think, 15. The real withdrawal begins after the election this December, the national election, next January, and the President and Secretary of Defense have said, in effect, I don't want to overstate what they said, but the signal that I took from it was that they have constructed this in such a way that they can, if they need to, slow down or halt. Though they didn't say so, I suppose they could even have said reverse the drawdown if the wheels begin to come off early next year. So we're a long way from the end. Privately, military commanders will tell you that they think that it would probably take another 5 years of an substantial American troop presence, including a substantial American combat presence, before Iraq would be really capable of ensuring its own stability. The Iraqi army, they have practically no air force. They have practically no navy, though that matters less. They have a very weak logistics system. They rely still heavily on the United States to supply everything from food to fuel, and they have a very weak command and control system. So there is a possibility, God forfend, that a year from now, things in Iraq will look a lot less encouraging than they do now. Afghanistan. Most of us who have worked in both Afghanistan and Iraq have long felt that if there was a truly unwinnable war, it was not Iraq, it was Afghanistan. Now, we're all of us, to one extent or another, victims of our experience, and my experience in Afghanistan goes back to the Soviet military occupation, which was when I first experienced it. And of course, we are all, I'm sure, aware of the history of Afghanistan and how no invading army has ever prevailed. I personally think it's highly unlikely that that historical pattern is going to be reversed. And I'll give you the reasons why. When you get a briefing, how are we doing on time?
About 35.
All right, so give me another 5 minutes. When you get the NATO briefing in Afghanistan, as I did in November, the first PowerPoint slide that goes up talks about NATO troop levels in Kosovo and Bosnia, and the Royal Navy captain who does the briefing goes on to say that if we had the same troop-to-terrain ratio in Afghanistan as we did in Kosovo and Bosnia, we would have 800,000 troops. This occasions general hilarity. Of course, they are never going to get 800,000 troops. The United States is on its way to building up its presence in Iraq to something like 65,000, 67,000 troops under the Obama expansion plan. Don't hold me to these precise figures, but that's more or less what it would be. And as we know, he's had great trouble in getting his European partners to commit. The meetings that he had over the weekend in Europe produced commitments for 5,000 more, but those were not all troops. The Germans are going to send more police and trainers, and they're not going to be putting their troops into the combat zones along the Pakistan border in the southeast and southwest. I should say parenthetically, and at some risk of offending people who are sympathetic to Germany, that it strikes me as being at least an interesting, curious inversion that a nation that was largely responsible for the two world wars of the 20th century can cite that experience as a reason for not being more assertive in supporting NATO in its hour of need. But that's a whole other question, and it's a minefield, so I'll stay away from it. But the French and the Germans are more or less maxed out as far as the war in Afghanistan is concerned. So we can conclude that insofar as there's going to be a real increment in fighting NATO fighting power, it's the United States and guess who? The United Kingdom. I could give you a whole evening's talk about the special relationship. It's been my experience in my lifetime that when useful things are done in international affairs, one condition is almost invariably present, and that is the partnership between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. But then, as we say in England, I would say that, wouldn't I? The Russian ambassador in Kabul, who I went to see when I was last there in the autumn, the early winter, a certain splendidly named Mr. Kabulov, which has nothing to do with the fact that he's working in Kabul. He's a Central Asian. But the interesting thing about Mr. Kabulov is that he was the KGB resident, that is to say the KGB boss, in Afghanistan almost throughout the Soviet occupation of the 1980s. He is having a very jolly time sitting in his reconstructed Soviet embassy and tutting at what he says are the American mistakes, replicating everything we did. It will end the same way for you as it does for us. Why do the American commanders not come and call on me? Because they don't want to know the reality. He told me that the Soviets had 140,000 troops there at the height in 1986. And we know what happened to them. I actually witnessed their withdrawal, and it was a miserable thing for them. I think troop levels are crucial. The Taliban own the countryside. The Taliban own the night. The Taliban, to some extent, own the spirit of the country. That's a very dangerous thing to say, because we know how much the women of Afghanistan fear the return of the Taliban. But the Taliban, we have to remember, when they swept over Afghanistan in 1995, 4, 5, and 6, to a large extent what they did was they codified the order that already existed in the Afghan village. Life there was always nasty, brutish, and short. Stoning to death for adultery, the cutting off of hands, no education for women. This was nothing new to the Afghan villager. It was something entirely alien to the only cosmopolitan city in Afghanistan, which is Kabul. So this is a tremendously uphill struggle. And it will take, and I think that we'd have to say that our politicians and military commanders have been honest about this. This could be a 15-year or 20-year struggle. Will the American people stick with that when the casualties, as will inevitably happen, mount? To date, about 630 American troops have been killed in Afghanistan, which is to say about 1/7 or 1/8 of the number of troops who were killed in Iraq. But unfortunately, we have to look forward to the possibility that those numbers will rise and that the American public will begin to be as restless about the war in Afghanistan as they have been about the war in Iraq. And that's before we get into issues of pitiful governance in Iraq. As you know, I'm sure, the president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, his own brother, is repeatedly accused of being involved in the heroin trafficking. Everything within the power of the government in Afghanistan is for sale. When Mr. Karzai has come under pressure on these issues, he's behaved, in my view, in a very sorry fashion by saying, well, perhaps you're not my friends after all, maybe I'll go and talk to my friends in Moscow. It will be interesting to see if he does, having signed into law this statute which in effect licenses marital rape, if he backs off from that. But even if he does, what does that tell us about the partners that we have there? Finally, because Ralph will be performing the function tonight that my wife, who is not here, would normally perform by sitting in the front row and drawing her finger across her throat. Pakistan. There's this protracted and I think rather ludicrous debate as to whether Pakistan is a failed state, as if there was some objective measure. Pakistan is a failed state. What is the good news from Pakistan when visiting cricket teams are subject to attempted assassination attempts, when the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, after $10 billion of American aid, much of it military aid, since 9/11, continues to arm, finance, and train the Taliban right under the noses of the United States government, if you will, when the United States has tolerated or encouraged, I'm not sure, the ascent to the presidency of Pakistan of Asif Ali Zardari, the widower of Benazir Bhutto, who has been, and one may suspect is, a deeply, deeply corrupt individual. At the risk of blowing my own trumpet here, I would refer you to a front-page story the New York Times ran after a 6-month investigation of the finances of Benazir Bhutto and Asif Ali Zardari in the early weeks of 1998, when I was still based in the Indian subcontinent. By means by which I will be a little bit elusive, we had come into possession of a 1,000-page dossier, product of some people who were deeply connected to Western intelligence agencies, which was basically the contents of the private filing cabinet of Mr. Zardari and Ms. Bhutto. We were able to calculate from that, and I'm talking about bank statements, correspondence, monitored telephone calls, and all the other things that intelligence agencies can do, which showed the theft of hundreds of millions of dollars. By the outside estimate, in her 2 terms as Prime Minister of Pakistan, the theft amounted to roughly the same as the total amount of foreign aid that had flowed into Pakistan during her years in power. It is this individual who has been placed in the position of President of Pakistan, our principal ally. Civilian government in Pakistan has been a woeful failure. I'm not suggesting I have any obvious solution to this. Clearly, the United States cannot be in the position of endlessly supporting and consorting with military dictatorships. But I think you could make the argument that civilian government has been in some ways more disastrous in Pakistan than has military dictatorships. It's going to be extremely difficult to find a reliable partner in Pakistan, whether it's Asif Ali Zardari or Nawaz Sharif, who has been his and Ms. Bhutto's historic political foe. And that's before you get into the rampant behavior of Islamic militant groups, encouraged by, supported by, again, the same ISI that we've spoken about before, where you have some increasingly signs that the heartland of Pakistan, not just the Northwest Frontier Province, is beginning to be overrun by Islamic militancy. This is surely a failed state, and you cannot prevail in Afghanistan, even with if everything in Afghanistan goes right, unless we deal with the problem of the sanctuary that Pakistan provides to al-Qaeda. One good piece of news, based on what? On instinct. I think that Mr. bin Laden will run out of time and space. It's commonly said by counterterrorism experts and by people who protect the President of the United States that the problem with protecting against terrorists and assassins is that those doing the protecting have to be lucky all the time, and the assailants only have to be lucky once. Well, that's an arithmetic or a calculus which can be applied to the situation in which Mr. bin Laden and Mr. Zawahiri now find themselves. It's pretty plain there's not much debate any longer as to where they are in general. There's a area of about 200 miles deep and possibly 50 to 75 miles wide along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border where they found sanctuary, most likely in the area of north or south of Waziristan. I don't know the map.
Kyle, I want to skip through to the second. That's it.
You see FATA, federally administered tribal areas. I'm looking here for the city of Host, K-H-O-S-T there. If you move east from there, roughly into the area from the LL wire federally, up through the INI administered, I think, if I remember right, it's north and south of Waziristan. That's probably where they are. It's an extraordinary thing that they have been able to escape American attempts to kill or capture them as long as they have. But my feeling is they will run out of luck. And you will have noticed in Mr. Gates' proposed defense budget on Monday, I believe, that one of the areas in which there will be increased expenditure is on predators, unmanned aerial vehicles. And if I may, I'll just close, and which are equipped with Hellfire missiles. They're a fearsome thing to see up close. They're the size of an executive jet. This is not a child's toy. This is a big aircraft. And they can take extraordinarily detailed pictures. And how good they are, I'll just finish with a story which relates to my last weeks in Afghanistan, in Iraq. I had wanted, preparatory to writing a book about Saddam Hussein's trial and execution, I had wanted to go to Saddam's grave, to which he was flown on a United States Army Black Hawk helicopter about 16 or 18 hours after he was hanged, when the United States had to prevail on the same aforementioned Nuri Kamal al-Maliki, that leaving the corpse in a white shroud of the executed president of Iraq lying in the back of a pickup truck in the parking lot of the Prime Minister's residence with anybody who happened by with a mobile phone camera free to reach inside of the back of the pickup truck, pull away the shroud and take photographs of the dead president. The Americans in Iraq prevailed on Maliki to surrender the body to his tribe, and the body was flown back through the night to an area south of Tikrit called Auja. And I decided if I'm going to write the story of the trial and execution of Saddam Hussein, I have to get there. Problem was that Auja was controlled by the insurgents. We sent out reconnaissance parties, the New York Times, to see if we could drive there. I knew I couldn't, even with a kufiyah and a dish dasher, I couldn't even make even a close pass at looking like an Iraqi. Our own security people told us it was impossible, that there were at least 20 militia-controlled checkpoints on the road, and it would be suicidal to attempt it. So I persuaded the United States Army, who doesn't like using their Black Hawk helicopters as taxis, to allow me to fly to Camp Spiker, which is northwest of Tikrit, principal American base in north-central Iraq, to do some reporting on the 82nd Airborne Division and its activities, but then to take 1 day off. I said, I need 1 day off to be free, to disembed, to go into Tikrit and do 1 or 2 things I need to do. They were reluctant to do it. They agreed. I went to Tikrit. I did my reporting on the 82nd Airborne Division, and the appointed day came when a platoon of young American soldiers were appointed to run me and a photographer down to Tikrit. It was a moment, a morally dubious moment, I have to say, because I realized during the morning briefing at about 0600 that the only reason that these 30 young Americans were going to Tikrit that day along one of the most dangerous highways in Iraq was to deliver us to our unannounced assignment. And I thought I perhaps really should say to the platoon commander, we can't do this. We can't put you at this much risk. I'm not sure I did the right thing in remaining silent. I can tell you the story because we got there and got back safely. They delivered us to Tikrit. There was some reluctance to leave us at the governor's headquarters, saying, sir, we are here to protect you. And I had to call the battalion commander on the US Army radio and say, you know, we would really like this time. So he said yes. We were taken to the governor's mansion by intermediaries to another point where we were handed over to the insurgents. And there was, I have to say, some risk. The insurgents' general attitude towards people like me was to imprison you and cut your head off. I didn't think they would do that because it involved Saddam Hussein. And I said we wanted to go and pay respects. So we were driven at high speed to Auja and into the former reception center. Auja, the village where Saddam was born, had been turned into, you know, a place of pilgrimage during his life. They turned the reception center into a mausoleum, and we were led into where Saddam was buried. And then I was offered a chance to sign the visitor's book. An insurgent TV were there, and they hovered over my shoulder as I pondered what to write in the visitor's book. And I could see, because I asked them to interpret, I don't speak Arabic, that the previous entries were, oh, all hail, eagle of the Arabs, come back, Saddam, and drive the Americans out, and so forth. I was trying to ponder what I could write in the visitor's book, which would get me out of there safely. Fortunately, the mind works faster in moments like that, just as the heart does. And I found 4 words that seemed to please them enormously. I wrote down, a place in history. And immediately, this book was passed hand to hand with great pleasure. Yes, you know, this is great history and our great leader. So they'd interpreted it in their own way. And then they took us outside to the graves of others who have been executed after trial, his henchmen. And then back to Tikrit, and I found my way back to Camp Spiker, where I was at the gate instructed that the commanding general of the 82nd Airborne Division would like to see me. So I thought, well, this is a real bumper day. I got to see Saddam's grave, and now I get to see the commanding general. I walked in, he's a Texan, I forget his name. And when I walked into his office, he said, oh, it's really good to see you. And he said, I've seen you on the television, but it's good to see you. And he said, how do you enjoy your trip to Auja? I said, how the hell did you know where I've been? Oh, he said, we had a little discussion. We tried to figure out what would you want to be doing, in Tikrit. We couldn't think of anything other than that's what you were going to do. So he said, but you know we have a responsibility. We brought you here. We need to look after you. So he said, we kind of kept watch. Come with me, he says. And he takes me down the corridor to a kind of mission control, which exists in each of the regional commands in Iraq. And it looks like Mission Control Houston. Banks of television monitors, a huge screen. And he said, run the tape. To my huge embarrassment, I discovered that one of these unmanned area vehicles had followed us from the moment we left the governor's mansion. And there I was the chief performer. They had seen everything. They'd been watching in a manner over my shoulder all along. He said, I'm glad you enjoyed yourself. We were there. I said, what would you have done? I said, we had means. We could have done something. We could have helped you. Which was a lesson which I shouldn't have had to learn in my 60th year, which is you can't fool the people who are smart. That they had prefigured exactly what we were going to do. They'd made their own calculations, and they'd let me get away with it. So I ended up wishing that I'd been straightforward with them from the start. I've talked for much more than the allotted 45 minutes, and I thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you very much.
Is that okay?
Yep. Did the videotape taken from the drone show you signing the visitor's book, and could they read what you wrote in the book?
Well, they didn't show it. They spared me that.
That's a facetious, rhetorical question. You predicted that in Iraq, the U.S. might be there for as many as 5 or perhaps a few more years than that, more. And you hinted that you'd been told U.S. role in Afghanistan could extend as long as 15 or 20 years.
Some of this has been said in public, as you know.
Should the U.S. role in Afghanistan be taking Taliban, reestablishing Afghanistan, or narrowly focusing on al-Qaeda?
I think the two are indistinguishable. I think the notion that you can find different kinds of Taliban is illusory. The dynamic in Afghanistan is towards cohesion, not fraction, in the Taliban, for one very simple reason, and that is that any Taliban commander who showed any interest in cooperating with the United States would find his body and his head separated very quickly. In addition to which, the people of Afghanistan, I think, feel that they can spot a winner. And at the moment, the winner they've chosen, or the winner they think they can discern, is not NATO, is not the United States. So if there were to be any hope of splitting Taliban and al-Qaeda, as in effect happened in Iraq, by the way, al-Qaeda has really been reduced in Iraq. I don't think al-Qaeda is going to make a comeback in Iraq. I think that it could only happen when NATO troops are prevailing in the field. I say whichever way you look at this, it comes down to having more troops and prevailing in terrain which, as you know, is so fundamentally alien to our interests and so very much favorable to the interest of the Taliban.
John, as you know, and as all of you know, we have viewers outside this room who are watching your talk on Second Life. And we've got a couple of questions. One of them comes from Virginia, one of them comes from Oregon, which are related, and that pertains to your talk. Number one, how significant, if at all, is Iran's role in the outcome in Iraq? That was the question. I'll expand it to say, how significant is Iran's role in Afghanistan? So maybe talk for a moment just about Iran's role in both arenas. And the second one is, for the United States, which one is more important? Is there a priority in Iraq, a priority in Afghanistan, or do you just have to do both?
Oh gosh, how to answer the last question first. As we know, it wasn't Iraq that brought us 9/11. It was Afghanistan. So I'm inclined to say, from an American's perspective, success in Afghanistan matters more, though the wider consequences for the Middle East of failure in Iraq would be pretty devastating too, in terms of what would happen in the neighboring states, which would no doubt get drawn in one way or another to a new civil war in Iraq. What would happen to states like Jordan? Would King Abdullah survive? We could see real trouble in Egypt. I mean, I'm not a Middle East expert, so it's probably I've already said more than I should. As for Iran's role, two contradictory thoughts, at least as far as both countries are concerned. First of all, you can assure that Iran will be meddlesome. That Iran, unfortunately, appears to have decided that they have a greater interest in frustrating the great Satan than they have in creating a stability which you would think would be in their own interest. It's a point that has been repeatedly made in international forums, and there have been some direct bilateral talks between American ambassador in Iraq and Iranian representatives. They've made absolutely no headway. The Iranians continued and have continued to supply the Shiite militias in Iraq with the most deadly armor-penetrating forms of IEDs, explosive devices. I think there's no doubt whatsoever from the intelligence that that's what they've done. You know, when I was a boy in England, there was a group called the Goons. You may remember the Goon Show. It was a sort of forerunner of Monty Python. And I remember as a small boy being a bit puzzled why they always referred to the Prime Minister of Great Britain having gone off to Paris to negotiate with, as they said, one of the French governments. France had a habit of having several governments at the same time, as does Iran. You know, you negotiate with Khatami when he was president, but you're frustrated by the supreme leader. That's still the problem. Is it this, does the president of Iran answer? The president of Iran is not much to choose between him and the supreme leader. But does he answer for the people who supply these deadly weapons to the insurgents in Iraq? I don't know. So I think that on the one hand. On the other hand, you'd have to say that, especially in respect of Iraq, there are limits to the tolerance, the ethnic and religious tolerance in Iraq to Iranian interference. What do I mean by that? In the New York Times bureau in Iraq, we employed quite a number of Shiites, many of whom had fought in the Iran-Iraq war and had no regrets about having manned Iraqi tanks as Shiites against the Iranian armed forces. What I mean by that is the Shiites of Iraq, while Shiites sharing the same religion, are overwhelmingly Arabs. They're not Persians. And the national factor is very important, and I think Iran has and will continue to overplay its hand.
All right, questions? Let's take a question from a student first, please. Student, question? Over here. Okay.
What would you define as Afghanistan's success? What do you think should be the definition of success in Afghanistan?
Okay, the question is, how would you define success in Afghanistan?
Well, I guess pretty well the way that the Obama administration has, which was to create a stable government, but not necessarily a government which answers to our standards of democracy. We already have that element. It doesn't answer to our standards of democracy, but I think a stable situation would require a very different kind of governance and a situation in which we were clearly prevailing in the war, and that's a long way distance. Military commanders are saying, if I don't mistake it, General McKin and General Petraeus and others have warned that it could take 2 years before we begin to see any significant improvement in the war there. And if you project beyond that, if that's when the turn begins at best, then the point at which you might begin to see some kind of stability could be anything up to, 5 years hence? Who knows, maybe this can happen. If we'd been talking here 3 years ago, 2 years ago, and most of us would have thought to talk about a situation in Iraq in which violence was down by 90% was entirely illusory, you would probably have shouted me from the room and thrown your hats at me or your shoes. Although I don't know if you do that in Delaware, do you? So who's to say? The conundrum here to me is that it's not difficult for people like me to sit here and say we think the war may be unwinnable. You know, but on the other hand, is it imaginable that we could afford to lose? What are the consequences of losing? I have often thought how happy I am to be, as Teddy Roosevelt said in Chicago in 1910, sitting in the bleachers. It is not we who are in the arena. It is not we, critics, journalists, who shed our blood, tears, toil, and sweat, a phrase I think that Winston Churchill borrowed in 1940. We are tremendously privileged to be able to sit and pontificate on issues which we have the absolute certainty of never having to play a role in deciding. So anybody who sits on a platform like this and says that he can imagine a formula that would win more certainly than the one that the government in the United States and its NATO partners have settled on would be a pompous fool.
All right, a question from a non-student? Yes, and all the way in the back.
How much of a role does Muqtada al-Sadr play in the Maliki government, or how much influence does his group have? And if he was the demon if he is the demon that he prayed years ago, why haven't we made more of an effort to take him now?
Okay, the question is about Muqtada al-Sadr, the Shiite leader in Iraq. How much influence does he have in Iraq? And if he's that influential, why hasn't the United States done away with him by now?
Well, he's a devilishly clever chap, Muqtada al-Sadr, and is utterly not to be trusted.
Have you met him?
No, I haven't, as a matter of fact. I've seen him, but I've not met him. I went to meet him once on his invitation for an interview, and when I arrived, almost at his door in a town called Kufa, which is to Najaf as is St. Paul to Minneapolis, and paused as instructed at the bridge across the Euphrates to be escorted to my interview, I was kidnapped by Mr. Sadr's people and taken out into the desert with 8 of my companions, a photographer and several Iraqis, and made to kneel down by a riverbank. It was probably as close as I came in my time in Iraq to the end. Fortunately, an argument broke out amongst these fellows as to whether the Sheikh, namely Sadr, had approved our dispatch. And it was, what the prevailing argument was that he hadn't, that we should be taken and parked somewhere. It's a whole story I'll spare you. Obviously, I wouldn't be sitting here if it hadn't ended well. Sadr has played both sides of the fence very effectively. In the view of many American armed forces, he should have been taken down right in the first week or 10 days after the invasion. He was implicated in, and it seems to me without any doubt, the very brutal murder of an Ayatollah Khoei, who was something of a friend of the United States and had been flown by the US military from London to Iraq and on to Najaf. Because the US intelligence agencies understood very well the balance of advantage in the so-called Majahiyya, the group of Ayatollahs who control Shiite Islam in Iraq. He went to war with the United States, as you know, a couple of times, and then he declared amnesties and ceasefires and started to surrender weapons, most of them useless. He put 20 or 30, or was it 40, I forget, of his loyalists in the parliament, provided Maliki with his measure of advantage, by which Maliki became improbably the prime minister of Iraq. He's been in abeyance because the United States hit Sadr's militia extremely hard during the last months of George Casey's time as Commander General and the first months of David Petraeus's British and American special forces. Really hit them hard. And Sadr more or less disappeared from view and has continued to stay out of view. But he's still a power. And if you ask me, when we hear Nouri Kamal al-Maliki in the last few months agitating for an early withdrawal date for American forces, they settled on December 9, 2011, which turns out to be 12 months beyond Obama's 19-month drawdown schedule. If you ask me how much that meant, I would say precisely nothing. Maliki had to do that because Sadr's card in the upcoming election in Iraq in December would be throw the occupiers out. Maliki needs to be able to say in those elections, but we did. They're on their way. But Maliki knows better than most how deficient his own armed forces are. So don't be surprised if he wins re-election to find Nouri Kamal al-Maliki singing a very different song next year about there's no hurry for you to leave. There's nothing good to be hoped for from Muqtada al-Sadr. He's a thug, he's a murderer, and I mean that literally. And I think that he will continue to be a seriously disturbing influence in the future of Iraq.
Okay, was there a student question up here? Go ahead. Okay, got it. What do you make of the corruption in the Afghan government?
Well, it's, as I've said, it's absolutely replete. And how do you end it? One step, obviously, that's been considered is finding a new president of Afghanistan. Why did Mr. Karzai sign his marital rape bill? Almost certainly because he's looking for allies in the forthcoming presidential election and found in the Shiites of Iraq one possible partner. It's not easy to unseat Karzai. There would have to be a credible alternate candidate. There are one or two who might win, but all the projections when I was in Iraq in November were that Karzai would likely win another election. And of course, as a senior official of the Bush administration said to me, we don't any longer have the Ngo and I may mispronounce the name, option, referring to what happened shortly before the assassination of President Kennedy to the then president, or was he prime minister of Vietnam, who was removed from office in a coup d'etat, which did have, as I recall, CIA support and the president's support, but they unfortunately put Mr. Diem and his brother in the back of an armored personnel carrier.
But you're saying the U.S. does not have that option now.
And they, at very high levels of the U.S. government, when these things have been discussed in relationship to leaders of Afghanistan and Iraq, they've said they don't have that option. You say, we want you to have a democratic system, they hold elections. What do you do when they elect the people that you don't want?
Okay, a question from a non-student. Yes, ma'am?
You said that the American army has reinvented itself and the surge has worked. Can you tell us how many Iraqis have been killed, how many have become refugees, how many have been injured in the last 6 years, and do you think it was worth it? Can you tell us who created, which empire created the country of Pakistan?
Those are two very different questions. Okay, first question is in Iraq. You said the surge had worked. Please describe the number of casualties among Iraqis killed, injured, and refugees.
Let me ask the second question first, because it's easier.
The second question was who created the empire in Iraq?
Who created the state of Pakistan?
Pakistan, sorry.
Well, of course, it was my compatriots and Lord Mountbatten, almost as he stepped on the airplane. And it was, I think, a very dubious thing. It's not the first time that the British have divided in that way, and that the consequences have been pretty severe, though whether India could have survived with a minority of restive Muslims, of course, is something we'll never know.
Just to follow up on that, though, also in terms of the current government, which you didn't really mention in your talk here, who has sustained the kind of government in Pakistan that Pakistan has had over the last 20 years?
Of course.
It's...
Yeah, no, I think I should get to your first question because you're touching on an extremely sensitive and perfectly legitimate question. I'm surprised you didn't throw a brick at me for not addressing that issue. Of course, the highest price that has been paid in Iraq has been paid in terms of Iraqi casualties, but it has to be said that those casualties have come down very, very sharply since the surge began. I mean, there were days when it was nothing to have 100 bodies found on the waste lots of Baghdad, I beg your pardon, in 2005, 2006, with the most grotesque injuries. I'm sure you read about it at the time. People didn't just have their eyes gouged out. They had various parts of their bodies drilled with electric drills. The situation was completely horrific. Those casualties have come down. I would say this, that be very wary of the kind of estimates that were made in The Lancet. You may recall the British Medical Journal, which adopted a curious arithmetic, which was sort of made all kinds of assumptions, and estimated, as I recall this in 2005 or 6, that 700,000 Iraqis had been killed. It was absolute nonsense. I mean, we did make a really good effort at the New York Times to keep on touch of this. And whilst we could not say to you then or now how many Iraqis died, I would say it was certainly no less than 70 or 80,000, and could have been as high as 200 to 250,000, but it wasn't 750,000 people. We had people working this on the telephones all day and all night because our editors wanted answers to that question. So we were able to get a general notion, but nothing that was particular. As for who was responsible, well, I guess we'll have to leave that one to history.
A question from a student? Yes?
Taking your example of Pakistan, a state which was considered relatively stable for a while, is that the kind of stability that we can anticipate in Iraq and in Afghanistan? And if so, should there be a fundamental rethinking of what we're doing in both of those countries and a better way to create stability that isn't quite so hollow?
Okay, questions about the definition of stability, really, and maybe in both Pakistan, Afghanistan, all three.
I think your question answers itself. It's extremely eloquent, and it raises very serious questions. You know, what kind of stability are we talking about? And it raises long-term questions about the degree to which we should try and intervene in these situations. On the other hand, when you have a country which is in the grip of Islamic militancy and has nuclear weapons, would you feel safe with an American disengagement? Let me ask you the question.
I don't think we'll take the answer here.
No. Just, do you have an answer?
We don't have any microphones in the audience. Okay, we can't do this. Sorry, we can't do it. Question from a non-student. Yes, ma'am.
I think
Any value? The question's about creation of a Pakistan oversight committee of experts and sort of non-government officials. Would that be of any value?
I think it would create howls of outrage from the government and the military of Pakistan without doing anything really effective. I mean, we know what's wrong with Pakistan. We don't need another oversight committee to tell us that. We already hear that in hearings in front of the Congress. We read about it in the pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. We know what the problem is. You know, I thank God, I say to you again, that we are not appointed under God, we journalists, to solve these problems. And if we pretend that we could, we're fools. These are extremely difficult issues, and I don't have any answer for this. And I have to say, it's a source of absolute wonderment to me that sane, healthy, intelligent, educated people seek these high offices of state. You know, who would want that? Certainly not me.
All right, question from a student? Is there a question from a student? Sure.
I was recently reading in the New York Times that the military is now dealing with warlords in Afghanistan and especially in Iraq about reaching out to insurgents. Is that part of the fundamental change in the military strategy in dealing with the
Well, of course.
Hang on a second. Yeah. So the question's about whether the strategy the U.S. military is using of reaching out to warlords in Afghanistan and also in Iraq is a change in U.S. handling of these kinds of things.
Well, I think there is a change. It was predictable that General Petraeus would have an interest in that, since in a sense, that's what happened with the Sunni awakening in Baghdad. But as he himself has pointed out, the conditions are very different. When we talk about warlords, and I'm not exactly sure who they're talking about, they're mostly Taliban-associated people. If he was talking about the warlords that emerged from the jihad against the Soviets, there's not much to be hoped for from them. These were the people who destroyed Afghanistan in the 1990s before the Taliban took over. People like Abdul Rashid Dostum, the warlord of the North. The greatest of the warlords, the one man who might have been able to create a stable Afghanistan, was Ahmad Shah Massoud, the Tajik leader in the north, by far the most effective of the jihadi commanders against the Soviets, somebody who won the real admiration of Soviet generals, and somebody who, and I don't hesitate to say this because I think most of my colleagues who knew him and traveled with his fighters would say, was one of the finest people that I have ever met. And he was assassinated 2 days before 9/11 by two Belgian passport-holding professed members of a TV crew whose camera was a bomb.
John, we have a question. I'm going to make this the last question from St. Louis in Second Life, and from another person in Second Life asking the same question. And it's off the topic tonight, but I know from talking with John earlier that you'll appreciate hearing his answers. They're asking about whether newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal you mentioned a moment ago, can survive the era of bloggers and the web and virtually everyone in this room reading the news, consuming the news on the web rather than in the physical newspaper. I know that's a topic for a whole other day, but maybe if you can just give us
Well, you know that it's long been said about war that there are no atheists in foxholes. Those of us of secular disposition in the newspaper business are a lot less secular these days and inclined to raise our hands to Providence in the hope that we can find our way through what is a truly frightening situation. To speak of the New York Times, I'd say only this, that if there's a way through it, we'll find a way through it. We are very ably led by people who have fully understood and grasped the possibilities of the web to vastly expand the range of what we do, and I think there'll be many in this room. Can I just ask you how many people here read once a week or more the New York Times web?
The web or the
web.
physical?
New York Times
the
on
web.
the web.
All right. How many
on the
read?
web?
On the web. Only about half. Okay.
Yeah.
How many of you read the physical paper?
Oh, well, that's interesting.
The other
it's
half.
very encouraging. I suppose special thanks to those of you who raised your hand last, because you guys pay for it.
How many of you don't read the New York Times at all? Either on the web or in any other way? Okay. All right.
Fine. Just a few simple facts. The New York Times has 800,000, give or take, paid subscribers, and they were and are the bedrock of our enterprise commercially. They provide by far the largest proportion of our revenues, I'm inclined to say in the range of 70% or so. The web provides something over 10%, I believe, and those figures were rising rapidly on a compounded basis until the present financial crisis, where they leveled off. That was a very unfortunate development, because the question that has hung over our survival, at least as far as Wall Street was concerned, was at what point did the falling print revenues intersect with the rising web revenues? And there were some who were inclined to say 2 or 3 years ago that that might come to pass within 5 to 7 years. This was just a question of doing the arithmetic. Of course, that's all changed now. Nobody, I think, would dare hazard a date. Indeed, our corporate leaders were very careful, never, at least never publicly, to put a date on that. There are some encouraging signs in this. First of all, our subscription readership has stayed largely loyal. We have had to be less radical than some other newspapers in our budget cuts. The Los Angeles Times is on its way to having only 50% of the editorial staff it had 4 years ago. If I remember the figures, 1,200 to 600. They've lost several executive editors along the way who've resigned in protest. We have the same executive editor. And if you want to read about newspapering in our time, go to the web and look. You might say he would say this, wouldn't he? But I actually believe it. And look at what Bill Keller has said in a number of speeches about it. I think he's been extremely insightful, and he is confident that we will find our way through this. They reduced our editorial staff by 10% last year, and they asked us a week ago to take what I thought was a very modest cut of 5% in our salaries. Of course, they may come back to us for more, but we're getting towards the point with the editorial staff, somewhat over 1,000, I believe, 1,100, 1,200, where it's going to be extremely difficult to reduce it any further at a time when we are having to ask our staff to do so much more because of the demands of the web. But finally, I would say, so as not to bore you to death and everybody can go home to their Passover Seder or to an early bed, that I personally cannot imagine America without the New York Times. And I just noticed when I travel on planes and airplanes, how many people read the paper and how many people seem to feel that their lives are enriched by it. And I'm not speaking about what I do. I play a very modest role in this. We'll find our way through it. We are going from the horse and buggy age to the age of the motor car. Mr. Daimler and Mr. Benz built horse buggies before they built motor cars. And we know what became of that. I think that we can be the Daimler and the Benz of this story, and that we can emerge healthy and profitable again. And I have to believe it, by the way, because I invested my life savings in the New York Times.
Before we say thanks to John Burns, let me just remind you about our next program. 2 weeks from tonight, April 22nd, right here in Mitchell Hall, we'll welcome Tom Segev, a historian and a columnist who will give us our first view in this year's Global Agenda series from Israel. That's April 22nd at 7:30 p.m. And just a reminder, if you're not already getting email messages about these programs and you would like to get them, sign one of those bright orange sheets out in the lobby, write your email address very clearly on one of those forms. Now please, let's say thanks to our speaker tonight, John Fisher Burns of the New York Times.